Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed us, 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it too if you shared the show within your orbit. Also, one more point, if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I'd love to hear from you. Do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Once again, israelcast@jnf.org. Listen, one book you have to add to your reading list is Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Its author, Yardena Schwartz, is our featured guest on this episode of the show. Yardena is an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer. From 2013 to 2023, she was based in Israel, where she reported for dozens of publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, The Economist, New York Review of Books, and Foreign Policy. She's also reported from Morocco, Nepal, Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany, and the United States. Yardena previously worked at NBC News and MSNBC. She graduated with honors from Columbia Journalism School in 2011 and earned an Emmy nomination in 2013 and an RNA Award for Excellence in Magazine Reporting in 2016. And with that, we very warmly welcome Yardena Schwartz to IsraelCast, who joins us now on the line from her home in the Hudson Valley. Yardena, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's so great to be here with you.
Well, listen, we've got so many bases to cover when it comes to the book, and really, it is so well researched. It's thoughtfully written. It provides truly a comprehensive view of the land of Israel for the last century. So I really think that anyone that wants to understand Israel today really should pick up a copy of the book. You know, they say, Yardena, the past is prologue indeed. And so I think that's what you've really achieved when you set out to write the book. Well, listen, I do want to dive into the massacre itself right now, because the massacre in question is really the Hebron Massacre, or the Hebron Massacre. We'll use the English name for the city, of 1929. And I'd really love it if you gave our listeners just a real brief primer on the massacre. And it's so interesting, Yardena, because when I told people ahead of our conversation that I was going to be interviewing you and about the book, so many people had no idea about the massacre.
Yeah, it's really astounding how little is known outside of Israel about this massacre, because it really was the worst pogrom ever perpetrated outside of Europe at the time of the Holocaust, before the Farhud, which occurred in Iraq in 1941, when the ancient Jewish community of Baghdad was massacred by their Arab neighbors. In 1929, this massacre in Hebron was actually more deadly and more gruesome than the infamous Kishinev pogrom, which had driven tens of thousands of Jews to flee Europe after the pogrom of 1904 in Kishinev. So the massacre of 1929 in Hebron occurred on a Saturday morning, August 24th, 1929, when 3,000 Muslim men marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron, then home to about 800 Jews and about 20,000 Muslims. And those men were armed with axes, swords, and daggers. And they went from house to house, breaking down doors, crawling through windows and rooftops to massacre the Jewish families who were huddling in fear inside those homes. And over the course of just a few hours, they slaughtered 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children. So the atrocities that were committed by the Muslim residents of Hebron against their Jewish neighbors on August 24th, 1929, were eerily similar to what happened on October 7th in southern Israel. Infants were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Children watched as their parents were butchered by their neighbors. Women and teenage girls were raped. And young men, yeshiva students, and elderly rabbis were castrated before they were killed or after they were killed. And the ancient synagogues that were located in Hebron for centuries were looted and destroyed, burned to the ground. One of the most gruesome sites of atrocities in 1929 occurred at the Hadassah Clinic in Hebron. It was a Jewish medical clinic that served the needy Arab and Jewish residents of Hebron, offered them free treatment and essentially free pharmaceutical care. And that day, the rioters ransacked the medical clinic, burning it to the ground, and also slaughtered the pharmacist who had worked there for 40 years and his family. So they killed him and his wife, they raped their daughter, and their other children became orphans that day, like many children in Hebron that day. And this Jewish community that had lived in Hebron for thousands of years, they were essentially exiled that day. This ancient Jewish community was decimated by the massacre, and the British authorities who ruled Palestine at the time evacuated all of the surviving Jewish residents of Hebron and told them not to return because they had proved incapable of protecting their Jewish subjects, not only in Hebron, but also throughout Palestine, because the massacre in Hebron that day was just one point in riots that gripped the entire area of Palestine, of British Mandate Palestine, which at the time was under British control. And the riots had actually begun a day earlier on Friday, August 23rd, 1929, in Jerusalem. And they were sparked by false rumors spread by the leaders of Muslims living under British rule at the time that stated that the Jews were working to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The man who first created this lie in 1928 was the leader of Palestinian Muslims living under British rule. His name was Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who had actually been appointed by the British to that role. And beginning in 1928, he started to spread this rumor that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the ancient temple. So basically to build the third temple on the Temple Mount, because Al-Aqsa, as listeners may know, was built atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem. And, according to the Jewish faith, one day, when the Messiah comes, and through the will of God, not the will of man, the third temple will arise from there. But what the Grand Mufti did was convince the Muslims of Palestine that the Jews of Palestine were actively working to destroy Al-Aqsa and to build their ancient temple. And the reason he began to spread that rumor was because he had been dogged by years of accusations of corruption and nepotism and misuse of funds. All of those accusations were valid, by the way. And once he started to spread this rumor, it really spread like wildfire because it was spread with the help of the Arabic media in Palestine and also by religious officials. So the imams in mosques throughout Palestine were spreading this rumor as well, stating it as fact. And in Hebron, one of the reasons the massacre was the most deadly site of these riots. I mean, the riots that gripped Palestine that week hit Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Acre. Essentially every Jewish community in Palestine was affected and evacuated by the British. But while 133 Jews and more than 400 others were wounded throughout the country, 67 of them were killed in Hebron. And, the fact that this place became the epicenter of those riots was really a shock to the Jewish community of Palestine and especially to the Jews of Hebron, because until that day, until August 24th, 1929, Jews and Muslims in Hebron had coexisted in such peace that Hebron was considered one of the safest places to be a Jew in Palestine. It was a place where in previous bouts of violence, the violence hadn't reached Hebron. when there were much smaller riots, Arab riots in 1920 and 1921, those riots never reached Hebron. And that was because of these remarkable relations that existed between the Jewish community and the Arab community in Hebron.
Right, Yardena, there's a lot to unpack there. And thank you really for that very robust description about what the massacre was. Also, we have a very varied audience. We have listeners around the world that aren't familiar with Israel and that aren't familiar with Hebron. I keep wanting to say Hebron. We're going to use them interchangeably in our conversation. They just come out as the word comes out as it comes out. Share with our listeners then what is significant about Hebron. What is there?
Yeah, it's interesting. So everyone knows about Jerusalem,
Mhm.
right? But very few people are aware of how holy Hebron is, not only to Jews, but also to Muslims and Christians as well. Hebron is the second holiest city in Judaism. It is the burial place of Abraham and Sarah and all of the matriarchs and patriarchs of the Jewish people, save for, of course, Rachel, who's buried in Bethlehem. But this place has been a site of, has had a Jewish presence ever since the days of Abraham. This is where he made his covenant with God. This is where he decided to bury his wife Sarah. This is where, according to the Hebrew Bible, Abraham purchased the first plot of Jewish property in the land of what was then Canaan, and what became the land of Israel. And to this day, Jews and Muslims and Christians pray at the tomb of the patriarchs on a daily basis. It's one of the few sites still standing today that serves the same purpose it served 4,000 years ago. And yeah,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, because interestingly, Herod the Great had built the structure above the tombs of the matriarchs and the patriarchs. And I want you to talk a little bit about how Jews actually were only allowed to go up to that seventh step.
Yeah, so not only Jews, but anyone who was not Muslim,
Hmm.
for 700 years of Muslim rule in Palestine, from about the 1200s to 1967, when Israel conquered Hebron from Jordan, which had occupied it since the War of 1948. They then granted access to Jews, Muslims, and Christians to
Hmm.
enter the tomb of the patriarchs. But until 1967, if you were not Muslim, you could only pray outside of the tomb of the patriarchs. And so the Jews who were living in Hebron at the time, there were actually no Christians living there. It was all
Yeah.
Muslims and Jews, about 20,000 Muslims, 800 Jews. And the Jews who prayed at the tomb of the patriarchs on an almost daily basis were forced to do so through a hole in the wall outside of the tomb that was built by the Jewish king Herod, in the first century BC. So yeah, this place has a very storied history, and in 1929, the um, the Jews of Hebron were kind of equally split between Ashkenazi and Sephardim. So, European, on the one side, on the other side, Jews from Arab lands, Jews from who had been exiled from Spain and Italy with the
Mhm.
Inquisition. Um, Many of the Jews living in Hebron at the time spoke Arabic because they had been living, side by side with their Arab neighbors for generations,
Right.
and or they had come from Arab countries.
Right. And one other thread that I want to pick up on what you were just sharing a moment ago is the notion that Jews and Muslims were living side by side. So those Jews that were killed, those Jews that were murdered, I don't want to say killed, they were murdered by their neighbors. They were murdered by people that they knew.
Yeah. So among the rioters were many of the assailants' friends,
Yeah.
not just neighbors, but friends, coworkers, landlords. Many of the Jews living in Hebron at the time rented their homes from Arab landlords. And in some cases, those landlords were among the rioters, breaking into their homes or leading the mobs, marching through the streets. And in some cases, and it's important to note, some of these landlords saved
Yeah.
their Jewish tenants.
Yes.
So while 67 unarmed Jewish men and women and children were murdered that day, At least 250 of them, of those who survived, were saved by their Muslim neighbors. Often it was their landlords who saved them by hiding them in their homes, standing guard outside of their Jewish friends' homes, and telling the mobs that if they want to enter those homes, they would only be able to do so over their dead bodies. And there were some cases where those righteous Muslim
Mhm.
heroes did suffer the cost. One of them was stabbed in the leg, but they managed to save their neighbors. And the other Jews who survived, many of them only survived because they pretended to be dead, or they were covered in the blood of their family members or friends or loved ones who had been killed beside them.
Right. This was just a traumatic experience for the survivors as well. And of course, as you said, they were really forced to leave Hebron. So it was Judenrein until fast forward, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. Um, the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. This is a good time to talk about him. If you can share with our listeners a little bit about his background, if you can share a little bit about his father, for example, who was very anti-Zionist and very anti-Jewish, share a little bit about his father, who his cousin was, by the way, but also the Mufti of Jerusalem and how he led his life and what he did and the atrocities that he really committed, because he's so seminal to the story in terms of really lighting the fire that, as you said, ignited not only the Hebron massacre, 1929, but riots before that, and also the havoc that he caused after that, and especially as it relates to what he did in his complicity with the Nazis in World War II.
Right. We could spend a whole hour
Yes, we
at
can.
least just talking about the
What
Mufti there,
time?
as you
What
said.
time do you have to pick up
Well,
your kids from school,
yeah,
Yardena?
right. Yeah, there's just so much to
Yeah,
unpack there. I mean,
yeah,
I'm glad you brought up his father, because the Grand Mufti came from a long line of Grand Muftis. This is basically the equivalent of the chief rabbi of
yeah.
Palestine. The Grand Mufti is the most influential, most powerful, most important Islamic official in the land. And I mentioned earlier that the British had appointed him to that post, but one of the reasons they did that,
And if I could
despite
just put a
his
pin in that
history,
for a
yeah,
second, and interestingly, it was the British Governor General, right?
it was the
Sir
British High
High
Commissioner
Commissioner,
of
excuse me,
Palestine,
Sir
who was
Herbert Samuel.
Jewish and a
Sir Herbert
Zionist.
Samuel, yes,
Yeah, Sir Herbert Samuel.
yes,
And one of the reasons he chose Hajj Amin al-Husseini was because his family was one of the two most prominent
yeah,
Arab families in Palestine. His clan was the Husseini clan. The rival clan was the Nashashibis. The Nashashibis were typically the mayors of Jerusalem, while the Husseinis were typically the muftis. And his father had been the Grand Mufti. His older half brother had just passed away, leaving that role vacant. But the Hajj Amin al-Husseini was not an obvious choice for the role. The other candidates were both more qualified scholarly, in terms of, they had completed the scholarly studies required to be Mufti, and Hajj Amin al-Husseini had
he
not.
didn't.
So he was not a sheikh. He was not. He didn't finish his Islamic studies, and yet the British High Commissioner Bert Samuel decided that it would be smart to put him in this role, not only because he was an opponent of Zionism, and so he would be seen as not being, one-sided in favor of the Jewish population, since he himself was Jewish, he was a Zionist, Herbert Samuel. So he wanted to show that the British would be, kind of equally, would treat both sides equally, so they weren't going to put in, someone who was in favor of Zionism. So many of the other leaders at the time were in favor of cooperating with the Zionist movement. It's hard to imagine that today, because the Palestinian movement has become so in line with the Grand Mufti's way of thinking, and he really set that formula. His impact cannot be understated. He really set the formula for every Palestinian leader, and that was his insistence that there could be no Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land. He believed, and he encouraged all Muslims in Palestine to believe, that Palestine was and will always be purely Islamic land, and that any kind of, effort to give the Jews of Palestine power would be an affront to Islam. Because let's remind our listeners that at the time of the British Mandate, when it began, it followed 1,000 years of Muslim rule in
Yeah.
Palestine, including about more than 400 years of Ottoman rule. And under the Ottomans, there had been strict limitations on Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Grand Mufti's father had worked to ensure that immigration to Palestine would be limited as well, despite the fact that he was selling land to Jews who were purchasing land in Palestine then. And, that was true for many of the ultra-nationalists, Arabs in Palestine at the time. The Grand Mufti did not sell land to the Jews, but many of the other anti-Zionist voices in his movement were
As they
actively
say,
selling land to.
go figure.
Right. So the Grand Mufti, even before he was appointed to his role, had already incited a deadly riot in Jerusalem in 1920, and he had actually fled arrest by the British and ended up living with Bedouin tribes in Transjordan before he was pardoned by Herbert Samuel and then appointed to his post. He was also the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which oversaw all Islamic holy sites and Sharia courts in Palestine. So he was extremely powerful. And so his propaganda campaign against the Jews of Palestine was so effective because he really had the control of all of these institutions, religious institutions, and his family was so prominent and so influential. They owned newspapers, so he was able to kind of control the message in the Arabic media as well, and silence his critics by kind of creating this facade of this much larger threat from the Jewish community of Palestine. And so once that threat existed, much of the criticism against him and his failure to improve the lives of the Muslims of Palestine, his failure to root out the nepotism and corruption and all of these problems that he had been plagued by, instead he just distracted the population from those problems.
Yeah, and he weaponized Islam, didn't he?
Exactly. He
That's
was
really
the
what he did.
first leader
Yeah.
to realize the galvanizing power of disinformation surrounding Al-Aqsa Mosque. Before he started to spread that rumor about Al-Aqsa, there had not been, this battle over Al-Aqsa that continues to this day. I mean, it's no coincidence that Hamas named its attack on October 7th the Al-Aqsa flood. Al-Aqsa and the lies surrounding this Jewish plot to destroy it continue to hold so much sway in the Palestinian psyche, sadly. And it's really just mind-boggling how that lie has withstood 1 century when, Israel controls the land upon which Al-Aqsa stands. If Israel truly wanted to destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild the temple, Israel would have done that by now. And yet the Palestinian leaders continue to promote this lie despite the devastating consequences that lie has had for the last
Yeah.
century.
And before we get back to the real thread, if you will, of how the Hebron Massacre in 29 really carried through, and the narrative really carried through into the 20th century and even into today, and as we said, October 7th, talk about his role in World War II, not only in terms of the Nazis and what he did in Europe, but also the Farhud, 1941 in Iraq.
Absolutely. So, following the massacre of 1929, the Grand Mufti remained in his post despite the fact that the incitement and disinformation that he had overseen leading to that massacre. And in 1936, he led another violent rebellion, this time against the British. And once that rebellion claimed the life of a British official, the British finally decided that they had had enough of the Grand Mufti. They decided to arrest him, but he fled Palestine and eventually ended up taking refuge in Berlin, where he lived in a Nazi-financed estate from 1941 to 1945. One of his first meetings in Berlin when he arrived in 1941 was with Hitler himself. He had a 90-minute, well-archived, well-documented meeting that is really astonishing. When you look at what he was offering Hitler, he told Hitler that the Arabs of Palestine were so grateful for what he was doing in Europe and that they hoped that he would come to Palestine and the rest of the Arab world to solve their Jewish problem. And he pledged his support for the Nazis and promised that he would work to recruit Muslims to fight for the Nazis, which he did. He recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis throughout his time in Berlin. He led the Arab branch. He was the founding director of the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He was the leading Arab voice of Nazi propaganda throughout the Muslim world, spreading Nazi propaganda on radio broadcasts throughout World War II. And he not only worked together with the Nazis, but also individually contacted various European leaders, urging them to prevent their Jewish refugees from fleeing Europe and ending up in Palestine. He told them to send them to Poland. And he knew what was happening in Poland. He had toured concentration camps. He was friends with the architects of the final solution. In 1943, he and Himmler exchanged letters congratulating each other on the great work they were doing. And when World War II ended, the UN placed Haj Amin al-Husseini on its list of Nazi war criminals. The Grand Mufti was wanted. The first leader of the Palestinian people was wanted for Nazi war crimes. Yet he was never prosecuted. He fled Berlin. He ended up first in France, then in Cairo, then Beirut, and he ended up leading the Arabs of the jihad of the Arabs of Palestine against the Jewish community. He declared jihad against both the Jews of Palestine and against the United States after World War II. And when the UN voted to partition British Mandate Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state, because the British had finally decided they wanted out of this place. They didn't want anything to do with it anymore. They wanted to hand over governance and independence to the people of Palestine, the Jews and the Arabs. And the Jews of Palestine embraced the UN partition plan and celebrated it, while the Mufti and every Arab leader rejected it and declared jihad. And the Mufti, who was then living in Cairo, had by then befriended and taken as a disciple his young cousin Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat assisted the Grand Mufti in helping to arm his Army of the Holy War, which he had created to fight against the Jews of Palestine in 1947. When people speak about the War of 1948, it's often forgotten that this wasn't a war only in 1948. This war began in 1947, the day after the UN voted to partition Palestine into two independent states. And that war began as a civil war by the Arabs of Palestine against the Jews of Palestine. And the Grand Mufti had been banned by the British from returning to Palestine, so he was still in Cairo and later in Beirut. But he was pulling the strings of that holy war from Cairo, from Beirut. Arafat went and fought in that holy war. And the Mufti actually was able to get more than 1,000 of the Muslim fighters he had recruited back in Berlin to fight for the Nazis in Europe. He sent them to Palestine, and they fought in that holy war against the Jews of Palestine. Of course, that holy war was then joined by the surrounding Arab states in 1948, and that's often what we refer to as the war, but it really began in 1947 as a direct response to what would have been a two-state solution. And had the Mufti and other Arab states embraced two states for two people in 1947, we would have a very different reality today.
And just to go back a moment, in 1941, he really incited the Farhud in Iraq, didn't he?
That's right. And that was why he fled to Germany.
Right.
When he first escaped Palestine, fleeing arrest by the British, he went to Italy because he was good friends with Mussolini. Mussolini had actually helped to fund his rebellion against the British in Palestine. And he stayed in Italy for just a short while, and then he went to Iran and then to Germany. And he fled Baghdad because he had helped to oversee a failed coup against the British-backed government there. And that coup was then followed by the Farhud, the massacre, the pogrom against this ancient Jewish community in Baghdad. People often forget that prior to 1948 and the kind of Arab-wide rejection and war against Zionism, essentially, there was a beautiful, thriving Jewish community in so many Arab capitals. In Baghdad at the time of the Farhud in 1941, there were at least 100,000 Jews living in Baghdad. Baghdad, I think at the time, was about 1/3 Jewish.
Yeah.
There were Jews in government. There were Jews in the most, prominent aspects of life in Baghdad, and all of that began to change after the Farhud, and that, of course, predated 1948. This
And
wasn't, a massacre in reaction to Israel winning the war of 1948, which is what happened in other parts of the Arab world, where
yes.
other Jewish communities in Arab countries like Syria and Egypt, they were systemically exiled, you know, all of their assets taken away by the state. That's what happened in other countries. And also it happened in Iraq later on after 1948. But in 1941, it was
Yeah.
really a direct result of the Nazi propaganda that had infiltrated the Arab community in Iraq, imported by the Grand Mufti and by another Arab leader in Iraq as well.
You're right. Before we move on, just one final question, though, about the Mufti. We might come back to him in the course of the conversation, but one thing I've never understood, Yardena, why was he never extradited? Why was he able still to remain wherever he was living? And why did he never go to trial as other Nazis did?
That's a great question. So when he fled Germany at the end of World War II, fleeing prosecution for Nazi war crimes,
Went
and
to
ended up
Cairo,
in
didn't he?
France.
Oh, okay.
So he first went to France,
Okay.
actually, and the British wanted to extradite him from
Oh, yes,
France,
that's right.
but the French didn't want to alienate their Arab allies. And at the time, France had very good relations with many Muslim countries, and it was Muslim dignitaries living in France at the time, many diplomats and ambassadors who helped get him out of France because he could have faced, they were afraid that the French would extradite him to
Hmm.
the British for prosecution, not only for Nazi war crimes, but also for his crimes against the British in Palestine, or extradite him for Nazi war crimes to another European country. So they spirited him out of France, these Muslim diplomats and ambassadors, and managed to get him from France to Cairo, um, escaping prosecution and any kind of arrest warrants that he faced. And in Cairo, of course, he was safe from prosecution because that's where many Nazis ended up fleeing. Cairo was a Muslim country that had supported the Holocaust.
Hmm.
The leaders of many Arab states had supported the Holocaust, and what I didn't mention earlier in my discussion of the Mufti's time in Berlin was that he had been promised by Hitler that once the Nazis had finished their work in Europe, as in, finished exterminating the Jews of Europe, they had planned to do the same in the Muslim world. Hitler had promised the Mufti that he would help oversee the destruction of the Jewish community, not only in Palestine, but throughout the Arab world. After all, there were millions of Jews living in the Muslim world at the time. And he had actually succeeded in arranging a Nazi plot to exterminate the Jews of Tel Aviv, but that plot failed when members of this unit that was ferried to Palestine from Germany, the Mufti had arranged this plot to contaminate the well water of Tel Aviv, and he had militants parachuted into Palestine and together with a Nazi official, and they ended up being caught with the help of local Arabs in Palestine who reported to the British police seeing people falling from the sky. And they found them in caves with chemicals that could have killed over 100,000 Jews in Tel Aviv. So, they tried to carry out that extermination plan. And it was only because their first effort at carrying out that plan had failed so miserably that the Nazis decided that they should wait to continue with their plans. And the Mufti was very disappointed, and he had tried to get them to bomb Tel Aviv, actually, tried to convince the Nazis to bomb Tel Aviv. They decided not to, thankfully.
Right.
But, his involvement, and not just his involvement with the Nazis, other Arab leaders as well were involved with the Nazis' hopes of annihilating the Jews living in Palestine and the Muslim world is really astonishing, and it's really shocking how little is known of that.
Right. I have to say, Yardena, you're right. I mean, we could talk about the Mufti and his horrible, horrible life and what he did for hours on end. Indeed. And in terms of just moving the story forward and history forward as well, I hope we're even touching the surface of so much that is in this book. I really want people to get this book indeed and read it, because it is just so chock full of history. And for history buffs, for those of us that love Israel, of course, I think people should read it. But again, as a history buff, it is absolutely fascinating what you have woven in this book, and so seamlessly. And when we talk about the book, this is a really good place, if you could just real briefly share with our listeners how the book came about and who David Shainberg was.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's really
Were you
important to note
waiting
that
for
this
me to
book.
ask the question, Yardena?
No, no, it was just a
You knew
really
it
good
was coming.
segue.
You
It
knew it
was a
was
great
coming.
segue because you say that it's, really a book of history, but it doesn't read like a book of history because
Yes.
it's told through the story of this young man, David Shainberg,
Yeah.
who was from Memphis, Tennessee, of all places, and
We
sailed to,
love Memphis.
and yeah, he sailed to Palestine in 1928 to study Torah in the land where its stories had unfolded, in what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in Palestine, the Hebron Yeshiva. And he was 22 at the time. And every week while he was living in Hebron, he wrote these beautiful, vivid, long letters to his family in Memphis every week. And over the course of his year living in Hebron, his family saved those letters. And sadly, he was among those who were murdered in 1929. But in 2009, almost a century later, one of his descendants discovered the box of his letters that had been hidden in her attic for decades. She was just moving to another home in 2009 and found this box in her attic and realized that she and her family were sitting on a treasure trove of history that really needed to be told, because these letters from David, her great uncle, didn't just tell his own story, but really told the story of Hebron, of a Hebron that has been lost to history. And so I really fell into, every writer's dream, in that I didn't come to this book. I didn't wake up one day and decide, oh, I want to write about this massacre in Palestine in
Because clearly you knew
1945.
about it and you've lived in Israel. Your husband's Israeli, so you have a very deep connection to the land of Israel.
Right. And I had been living in Tel Aviv, reporting for dozens of
Right.
publications, but I had never written a book. And it was actually in 2019 that I started writing this book. So, 4 years before October 7th, I started writing about this massacre in 1929. And it was only because this family found and entrusted me with these letters, and in telling the story of David Shainberg, and really telling the story of Hebron and the transformation of Hebron from what was in 1929 a
Mhm.
beacon of coexistence to what it
Yes.
is today, which is really the antithesis of coexistence. And, I was still writing my book on October 7th, 2023.
Mhm.
And it was always going to be about David Shainberg and about this massacre and how this massacre had really transformed the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it was always going to take us from 1928, from David Shainberg's journey to Palestine in 1928 to today.
Mhm.
But never could I have known how relevant this massacre would become, and it's more relevant than I ever wanted it to become, obviously. But when I was about 2/3 of the way through writing my book on October 7th, and I realized just how informative this massacre could become to people's understanding of this conflict, because what happened in 1929 didn't just happen again on October 7th, but on a much more massive scale. And the everything about it was just everything about history was just repeating itself before my eyes, because it wasn't just the atrocities that were so similar, but also the denial and victim blaming that followed October 7th. The same thing happened in 1929. There was just this massive effort across the Arab leadership in Palestine and Arabic media in Palestine to both deny that these atrocities had taken place, deny that they were carried out by Arabs, and to blame the atrocities on their Jewish victims, both on a micro scale and a macro scale. On the micro scale, they literally blamed the atrocities committed in Hebron on the Jewish yeshiva students, despite the fact that Jewish yeshiva students were killed in the massacre.
And they weren't even Zionists. They were just religious kids that wanted to study Torah.
Yeah, the Jewish community of Hebron in 1929 was, in a way, anti-Zionist.
Yeah.
They were traditional, pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. They had even rejected efforts in 1904 to hold a memorial to the late Theodore Herzl, who had recently died. There was a request to hold a memorial in Hebron, and the Jewish community said, no, we're not fans of Theodore Herzl. So the letters of David Schoenberg, one of the reasons I was so captivated by them was because he himself was not a Zionist. He referred to the Zionist movement as a vile anti-Jewish movement because, like I said earlier, many traditional Jews at the time saw Zionism as a secular movement and not as a Jewish movement, because so many of the founders were secular. They weren't religious.
And we should share with our listeners, because I think most are familiar with the word Zionist, but for those that aren't, it's really about the Jewish people's right to self-determine in the Jewish ancient homeland, which is the land of Israel. It doesn't mean that the Arabs can't have their own homeland, but it just means that we need to have our Jewish homeland in the ancient land of Israel. And that's really that's really what it means. Before we get to October 7th and where things stand today, and just the culmination of really how this horrible event in 1929 really resonates till today, can you talk about one or two touch points along the way, Yardena, for our listeners about how the Hebron Massacre in 29 impacted certain historical events and certain historical characters, persons along the way? I'm thinking in particular about Mayor Kahane, for example, and we don't get into politics here on the program for a whole host of reasons, but if you can just talk about that in terms of how Jews returned to Hebron after 1967, because it was Judenrein, really, wasn't it? Before 1948, after the massacre, from 48 to 67, I should say, yeah.
Right. So when Israel took control of Hebron and the rest of the West Bank from Jordan in 1967,
the Six-Day War.
Right.
From the Six-Day War, yeah.
Exactly. Hebron was one of the first places that Jews returned to and said, we need to rebuild this home. It was very much on their minds that this ancient Jewish community had been violently expelled. And now that it was in Israeli control, they wanted to rebuild this devastated Jewish community from the ground up and revive this ancient Jewish quarter. And the Israeli government actually opposed those requests to reestablish the Jewish community, because at the time, and for several years after the Six-Day War, Israel thought that it would hold on to this land only as bargaining chips to return in exchange for peace. And Israel had offered peace with the Arab countries that had invaded it in 1948 and after 1967 as well, saying that, if you are willing to accept us as a Jewish state in our ancient homeland, in return for peace, we will give you back this land. The Israeli government didn't want to hold on to the West Bank at the time because it was inhabited by so many Palestinians who were in effect enemy combatants. I mean, they had, just days before, in the case of 1948, 1967, fought against the state of Israel, Israel wasn't interested in holding on to that land. But after 1967, almost immediately after Israel started to offer that land in exchange for peace, the Arabs returned with the infamous three no's.
Yeah.
No negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel. And so, and terrorist attacks began to occur in the West Bank. And with these terrorist attacks, many of the Jews who had been clamoring for a return to Hebron were saying to the Israeli government, you know, it doesn't, you know, they don't want this land back. They don't want to accept us. Allow us to revive this Jewish community. The man who revived the Jewish community of Hebron had already by 1968 helped to reestablish a different Jewish community that had been massacred, this one in 1948. That was Kfar Etzion. And so Kfar Etzion was actually the first settlement to be built after 1967, but Hebron followed soon after, when a group of Jews held a Passover Seder in a hotel in Hebron, and then told the government that they would not leave unless the Israeli government allowed them to rebuild the Jewish community in Hebron. The government ended up negotiating with them and saying, okay, we won't allow you to live in Hebron because it's too sensitive, it's too much of a minefield with the Arabs, but we'll allow you to build a new town on the outskirts of Hebron, and that town was Kiryat Arba.
Right.
And when Rabbi Meir Kahane, the founder of the Jewish Defense League, who was later moved to Israel and established the anti-Arab Kach party, which was then outlawed by Israel, when he moved from New York to Israel, he moved to Kiryat Arba. And he
And the
had a
reason
large following in
yes,
Kiryat
and the
Arba.
reason why I brought him up in particular, because in the book you pointed out that the Hebron massacre was a driving force for him.
Exactly. So that was one of the reasons why he moved to Kiryat Arba.
Yeah.
He, according to his disciples and according to his own writings, the massacre of 1929 was one of the bedrocks of his ideology. And because he had had family in British Mandate Palestine that was affected by the riots of 1929, he understood, or he felt, that the Jewish community that had rejected offers of help from the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the IDF, in 1929, they had warned Jewish leaders in Hebron that there was going to be a massacre there. And the Haganah was armed in Jerusalem, and they had managed to defend Jews from attacks in Jerusalem. One of the reasons in Hebron why the Jewish community was so defenseless and so helpless in the face of this massacre was because they had no arms, they had no way of protecting themselves, and they had rejected the offers of protection from the Haganah, insisting that their Arab neighbors were their friends and they would never hurt them. And Kahane was deeply impacted by those stories and by those testimonies. And that was one of the reasons he felt that Jews should never be defenseless again. I do not agree with Kahane's ideology. He was banned from Israel's Knesset for a reason. He was relegated to the very fringes of Israeli politics for good reason. But I'm just explaining that this was
Sure.
one
But
of the reasons
right.
why he
And
felt that way.
right. And the reason why I wanted to bring him up is because he was one of the people that you pointed out in the book also that was part of this thread from 1929
Exactly.
until the October 7th massacre. Well, I want people to get the book because I want them to fill in a lot of the blanks that we just simply don't have enough time to cover. It is such a rich book. You're very descriptive in terms of what Hebron is like today, both for the Arab community and for the Jewish community. So I want people to really read that. I want to ask you, as we begin to wind down our conversation, on a couple of really personal notes. I want you to talk about the reception that you have or have not received as a result of having written the book.
Yeah, so I'm really grateful that readers have just responded so powerfully to the book. And I've had amazing reviews in the Jewish press. Interestingly, though, despite the fact that I come from the world of, mainstream liberal media, I worked at MSNBC, NBC, written for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Time Magazine, foreign policy, you name it. I've probably written for them, and not one of those publications has been willing to cover my book or even mention my book. Not to say that I was expecting, a New York Times book review. It's pretty difficult to get a book review in the New York Times, but not one of the publications I wrote for has covered my book, except for, sorry, the Wall Street Journal, because it's a conservative publication, at least, leans slightly conservative. Yet I am not a conservative in my politics. This book is not a
No, it's a
conservative.
very
It's not left
even-handed.
wing or right wing.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
very even-handed book. It's a real historical document.
exactly. And it really paints just a historical, factual picture of the truth of this conflict and the history of this conflict. And I think that sadly today, a lot of the news organizations that we have come to respect have really just failed in their duty to give their readers the truth. And instead, they really just want to elevate certain books that confirm kind of conventional
Mhm.
wisdom or one-sided narratives. And because this book doesn't fit into a one-sided narrative, it has not gotten the kind of coverage I think it should be getting. Not for my sake, but for the sake of people to understand this conflict for what it is, and so that we can get out of this endless cycle of violence that we have been relegated to because of the dangers of incitement and disinformation and misunderstanding the facts of history that really tell us how this conflict can end. And that is through peace. And through coexistence. That's something that has been rejected for far too long.
And as my 95-year-old Holocaust surviving rabbi likes to say, mutual respect,
Exactly.
right? One or two really quick ones, if you don't mind, Yardena. Um, you also had some very personal connections, if you will, to October 7th. Your husband had two cousins that were killed, that were right. And
Yeah.
also, I got so choked up when I was reading about your daughter's Hebrew school teacher, and I want you to talk about that, if you don't mind, just real briefly.
Yeah. So on October 8th, 2023, I took my daughter to Hebrew school here in the Hudson Valley, and her teacher at the time, Maurice Schneider, who had lived in Israel for many years. He was originally from Peru, but was living next door to our synagogue at the time in Kingston, New York. He showed up that morning in tears, and he told me, I asked him, I thought he was just crying because all of us were just,
Yeah.
devastated by what had happened the day before. But he said that his sister was missing, his sister and her husband were missing, and that her children were also missing, her grandchildren. It turned out he was the uncle of Shiri Bibas, and he was showing me pictures on October 8th, 2023, of his nephews, his little ginger headed nephews
Yeah.
who were the same age as my own children. They were 9 months old, 4 years old at the time. And several weeks later, we discovered that Maurice's sister and her husband had been murdered on October 7th. Their bodies were discovered on their kibbutz. And by then we knew as well that his niece, Shiri, and her husband, Yarden Bibas, had been kidnapped along with their young children. And, I went to his Shiva that he held in his home in Kingston for his sister, Shiri's
Mother,
mother and her father, who
mother.
were murdered. I remember him telling me then, you know, we can, we have forever to fight Hamas. We don't have any time to rescue Shiri and Yarden and Kfir and Ariel. We need to get them out now. And, throughout these past 18, 19 months, it's just been, I've never forgotten his words. And I heard those words from many hostage families that I spoke to in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, and saying, we don't have time to get them out. We need to get them out now, and we can fight Hamas another day. And, I really wish that people had listened to those hostage families and had, gotten the hostages out first before fighting this war against Hamas, which is an essential war, as existential war. No one is saying that we shouldn't fight Hamas, but I think that we should all agree that the priority should have been and should still be getting the hostages out. before anything else.
Right. And we just pray for the well-being and safety of those that are still alive and that they're going to be out now. That's all we can say. All right. Well, listen, on that note, we're going to leave it right there. Again, Yardena, I just want to thank you for writing this book. I hope I was able to do it some justice in our conversation, because we absolutely just touched the surface, and really want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of IsraelCast. And really, we hope to have you back to talk more about this and other future projects that you have. So really, thank you so much again. And for you, our dear listeners, once again, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. You can pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. It's graduation season. Give it to a graduate. You're going to someone's home for Shabbat dinner. Keep the wine at home. Give them a copy of the book so that they can learn about the tragic events of 1929 and indeed how they have impacted our time today. All right, well, we'll have info about Yardena on the show notes page of this very episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And for you regulars, you know that we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for IsraelCast. And as I say, don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more people around the world to find us and to hear from people just like Yardena. You can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And indeed, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, J.D. Krebs as well. And our editor is the one and only Jay Rothman. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. It's very easy. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello, as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can always email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Once again, israelcast@jnf.org is our email address. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.